With great power comes great responsibility.
Compromise where you can. Where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right. Even if the whole world is telling you to move. It is your duty to plant yourself like a tree, look them in the eye and say no. You move.
Never step onto the battlefield of ideas unprepared. Before you enter the fray, you need a plan. And there's no better place to get one than right here on Tactics with host Caleb Colquitt. The Situation Room goes live now on News Radio 1440.
Welcome into the program, everybody. Thank you so much for being back with us on your Monday to get your week started out right. And I got to tell you, I had a great weekend. I really did. I had an amazing weekend. I was up with my friends. I got to go watch Avengers Endgame, which, by the way, I'm going to be giving my full movie review. It's going to be spoiler-free, so you don't have to freak out if you have not seen the movie yet. You can look forward to that a little bit later in the program after we've gotten through some news. So I am going to be doing that, and got to see the movie with a bunch of my friends from there in the Huntsville area. Got to go to church for my friends and family day up there at their congregation and got to lead prayer there. So it was a great overall weekend. And one thing that was really cool is that I actually got to fly an airplane. That was really crazy. Had no idea that I was going to be doing that when I went up there, but I have a friend who has her pilot's license, really good at this kind of stuff, really knows her stuff, and had been training for a long time, as long as I've known her, pretty much, to try to get her pilot's license. And she took me up, let me fly the plane for a little bit. We had a really great time, some amazing views. If you're somebody that's friends with me on Facebook, feel free to go and look at some of the pictures that we took up there. And just got to kind of fly around the Huntsville, Decatur area and see a lot of stuff. So really awesome. And by the way, the plane that I was flying was a Cherokee, so I believe technically that makes me more Native American than Elizabeth Warren just by piloting that craft. But nonetheless, I had a great weekend. And the thing about when I go on, not really vacation per se, but when I do a weekend away, so that I don't stress out and so that I enjoy myself more, I make it a point not to watch the news. I make it a point to maybe not completely disconnect, because I will share a story every now and then, but I'm certainly not on top of things, and I make it that way intentionally so I have time to relax and hang out with the people that I care about and just enjoy their company without worrying about what's going on in the world. I like to unplug, and I've found out the more that I talk to other media personalities that they kind of do the same thing. And it's the first weekend I've had away in a while, probably be the last one I have for a long time. So I really wanted to enjoy it and not really focus on work and focus on keeping up with what's going on in the world. And then I came back and found out last night that there was a shooting Saturday in a synagogue in Southern California. And it does hit you like a ton of bricks, especially when you're a news person and you kind of take a step back for a minute and then you come back and you realize how much that you've missed. I don't regret it. I'd do it the same way if I had the option to do over again, so that I wouldn't have to stay on top of things. But it really does not force, but definitely gives you a sense of perspective that, you know, just because you cut the world out for a little bit, it doesn't mean that it goes away. And that's fine. And I think that it's a healthy thing to get away from the news and get away from the cares of the world, at least for a little while before coming back. But when you do that, it hits you even harder when something like this happens in that period. And the way that it hit me is no comparison to the way that it hit those that are specifically connected to this. So to give you sort of the raw facts, and I do want you to remember that my 48-hour period actually has run up, because this occurred at 10 a.m. on Saturday morning, so it's actually been a full 48 hours since then. And so my rule about not talking politics and not talking about the fallout of the event actually doesn't apply at this point. I've already run that's already run its course. But for right now, just to get you an understanding and a context of where to come from, here are the raw facts. What we know for sure is that a lone 19-year-old gunman armed with a .233 AR rifle fired off about 10 rounds. And .233, very common ammo type. I mean, it's basically, when it comes to rifles, it's kind of the 9mm of the rifle world. It's just a very common standard issue ammo for the AR platform rifles. And so the Armalite rifle, .233, and fired about 10 rounds. We do know, though, that his gun jammed. And thank God for that. That's a lot better than running out of ammo when you're dealing with somebody that's a mass shooter. And the reason for that is, somebody runs out of ammo, it's no big deal. I mean, it's better than having not run out of ammo, but you can replace your magazine pretty quickly. All you have to do is press one button, your magazine slides right out, you grab another magazine out of your back pocket or your ammo belt or whatever you happen to have on, slide it back in. It takes all of 5 seconds, which granted buys you a little time, but not much. A gun jamming, that, depending on how badly it's jammed, that can put a gun completely out of commission for several minutes, if not longer. And I've had ammo jam on me, very rare, doesn't happen all that often, but it makes the gun virtually inoperable until that jam is cleared. And sometimes if the bullet's stuck in there tight enough, that could basically just disable your gun. That could disable your firearm, at least for a time. And so that's why really it is a blessing. And the rabbi that was at the synagogue that was shot referred to it as a miracle. Now, I'm always a little bit skeptical of calling things a miracle that I don't know that are miracles. And I also think there is a slight distinction, even though I won't get into all the details right now because it's beyond the scope of the story. There is a difference between God's providence and miracles. I would be a lot more comfortable saying this was probably God's providence, that his gun jammed and it jammed the way that he did. I don't know that it was something that was actually miraculous. But nonetheless, I do think that God was involved. I do think that God was looking out for these people. And there was a gun jam after only 10 rounds being fired. Now, 10 rounds can cause a lot of carnage, and it did. And it can hurt a lot of people, and it did. But it is comforting to know that this could have been so much worse and wasn't, because the guy's gun did happen to jam at a very opportune time. And we do thank God for that, for sure. Whether he directly intervened there or it was happenstance that he sort of directed, either way, it's a blessing that took place and it wasn't worse than it could have been. And this took place in the final days of Passover for the Sabbath service at the Chabad of Poway Synagogue near San Diego, California. So it's not actually in San Diego, California, but it's very near that area. San Diego is about where you're going to be. And the thing is, this was a festival celebrating the end of the Passover, which takes place over the course of a week. And of course, we all know Passover, if you've studied any part of the Old Testament and know a little bit about the Torah, that is the festival that celebrates the return of Israel out of bondage and their exodus, which is the reason for the name of the book, their exodus from Egypt going towards the land of Canaan. So that is the promise of Passover. That's the reason that it is celebrated, and it takes place over the course of a week. And this Sabbath was the final day, so Saturday. This Sabbath service was the final day of their big Passover festival, and on this last day, around 10, 11 o'clock in the morning, that's when this horrific shooting actually took place. And as we know right now, there is 1 dead and 3 injured, including the rabbi and a child. But all those that were injured are alive and have already left the hospital. So even though there was 1 death, which is of course horrible and tragic, I believe the lady's name there was Lori. And even though her death is tragic, and of course we mourn her loss, we are very grateful that the injuries were minor enough to where we're only a little over 2 days later, and all 3 of the wounded are walking around. Now, the rabbi lost a finger, and I don't really know about the injuries of the others. But the rabbi there that was preaching, he did lose one finger. He was shot in his other finger, and he could still lose the second one. But considering what this could have been, losing a couple of fingers is, I mean, obviously it's not a good thing, but it's far preferable to what the alternative was. And I was just listening to an interview actually with him on the Ben Shapiro Show, which is featured right here on News Radio 1440. And it is so incredibly powerful to hear him talk about his experience here. This is Rabbi Israel Goldstein. And Rabbi Goldstein was, I mean, just his perspective on this is just absolutely amazing. And one of the things that he talked about, which I didn't even think about because I'm a guy that's been behind the pulpit, obviously not as a rabbi, as a Christian minister, but I've been up there giving a sermon. And the thought of somebody coming into my congregation, the congregation of people that I call family, that I love and respect and think of as brothers and sisters, somebody coming into the congregation that I worship at while I'm preaching and opening fire, I mean, I can't even imagine what he must be going through right now. And having one of my sisters in Christ, or in his case, a fellow worshiper there that was one of the people that attended his synagogue, having them no longer with us, and hearing him talk about this, where he came in, because you have to remember, the entrance to this place and where the gunman came in was kind of at the back, and so he was one of the first people to see and notice it because he's facing the crowd. He's not facing the front like everybody else, and so he's the first one to see it, and presumably, based on his account, it sounds like he was the first one to react. Now, I understand the being a minister part of this. I don't really understand this next part because, of course, I'm a single man. I don't have any kids. At this synagogue, his children and grandchildren are in attendance. And his little grandson is there. He's a baby. He's asleep because he's not old enough to really get anything out of the lesson. He's in a stroller, sitting there resting comfortably. That's how young he is. He's just there in his little stroller taking a nap, and he's there in the line of fire. And this guy, a rabbi, is there doing his lesson, and his first thought is that he's got to help his family. So immediately, he takes off from the pulpit and goes and tries to get his family out of harm's way, with specifically worrying about his little grandson that's not old enough to know what's going on and try to get out of the way and understand where the danger is. And so he's having to grab this stroller and trying to, as quickly as he can, usher people out of the way of this psychopath that came in and wanted to kill them and do them harm for no other reason than the fact that they happen to be of Jewish descent. And to hear him describe that story is just, it is absolutely heartbreaking. But even after that, he goes, and once he knows that everybody's safe and the gunman was chased off, and we'll get to that part of the story in a second, then he goes and he calls 911 on his landline, I guess in his office, and he gets an all circuits are busy signal at least twice. And then he finally calls in, and then they ask him to be put on hold. This is 911 that he can't get through to, and then he has this, they finally do let him through, and they ask him to be put on hold. And keep in mind, at this point, he doesn't know where the shooter is. He knows that there were some people that were trying to take care of the shooter, but he doesn't know if they were successful. For all he knows, the gunman is right outside his door waiting while he's trying to get 911 on the phone to tell them there's an active shooter situation. And so he finally does, and eventually the cops are able to get there. But the fact that their 911 line was so clogged up and so unable to take the volume of calls that they were presented with that day for whatever reason, there is a good chance that lives could have been lost. Now, there weren't because of that specifically, because the lady that was shot before this. But it could have been, and I do think that if nothing else, that's a reason for us to remember how important it is to have 911 and our dispatch adequately staffed when it comes to things like that. So here's a little background information on the gunman, and I'm not going to use his name, and I'm actually going to make a point as to why I don't use his name or the names of any of these crazy people that go in and try to hurt other people. The gunman was also wanted, even though they didn't know it at the time. They were able to make the connection. According to ABC News, he was also wanted in a March 24th arson of a mosque that is about 15 miles away. So it's not just the Jews this guy hates. He also hates Muslims. So he's already tried to burn down a mosque, and I don't have a lot of the details on that because it wasn't very specific, but he's already tried to burn down a mosque a little bit earlier, about a month ago, and now he's attacking Jews in synagogue on the last day of Passover. So because of that, and we've kind of confirmed this now because we found out more about this guy, when I heard that and when I heard that these were the two things that they had connected him with, it was pretty clear this guy's probably a white supremacist because he hates the Jews and he hates the Muslims. Well, there's not that many groups that hate both of them. So white supremacist is pretty much the only one that would have a reason to hate both of those groups. And so white supremacist was the likely the likely motive for this horrific shooting, and it turns out that was exactly right based on stuff that we found, stuff that he's written. There was I believe about 3,000 or 4,000 page manifesto on the dark web claiming that he was inspired by the Christchurch massacre and the Tree of Life massacre in Pittsburgh. So you'll remember the Christchurch massacre that happened in New Zealand, where the multiple sites where the gunman went in and tried to kill Muslims worshiping in the mosque on when they all went together to congregate, which wound up ending in about 50 people being killed. I believe it was exactly 50, if I'm not mistaken. So 50 deaths in that scenario. And then you'll also remember last year, around the end of October, beginning of November, somewhere in that time frame, that there was the Tree of Life Synagogue shooting, where, kind of similar to this, a crazy person came in and tried to gun down a bunch of people worshiping at a synagogue because they were Jewish. And so this guy cites both of those attacks as his inspiration for doing so, which, by the way, is the reason that I don't talk about these people and their identity and give them some notoriety. And frankly, I think, despite the fact that we've seen all this evidence that the primary contributing factor to these mass shootings and these very public attacks is that we get to the point to where we in the media, and I'm including myself in this even though I haven't done this, and I've made it a policy to try to do my part and not name the shooter and not talk a whole lot about his ideology, or at least avoid it as much as I can and still give the whole story here. They glorify, and even though they don't intend to, they sort of, in the minds of these insane people that want to harm people for whatever reason, they glorify the shooter by going in depth, finding everything out from their name to their lifestyle, how they wound up orchestrating the attack and planning it. They talk about the motives. They will read parts of the person's manifesto. And so I do think that sometimes that is relevant to the story, and I also don't think that it's a wise idea to go too far the other direction and never talk about what the motives were. Because if you don't talk about what the motives are, you can't really use it as a cautionary tale. You can't really use it to express to people why these ideologies are dangerous, and white nationalism is a horrific, dangerous ideology that should be snuffed out, partly because it results in things like this. The same thing with radical Islam, the same thing with eco-terrorist, whatever the motive is. I do think it's important to know the motive of attacks like this, but I also don't think it's wise to delve too deep into the ideology, because then, at least in the minds of these crazy people that kind of subscribe to this and want that notoriety, they want that infamy that comes with being a mass shooter, then all of a sudden it drums up in their mind, wow, this guy's ideas are now being broadcast on a national level, and this is a way to get my ideas out there. You see why that can be very dangerous? You understand why that could be something that is maybe not, because if you're messed up in the head enough that you want to kill people, you're obviously off your rocker. The elevator's not going quite to the top there. But especially if this is a person that feels like nobody's listening to me, and normally that's what happens. The typical profile of a mass shooter is somebody that's kind of a loner. They don't necessarily fit in with the rest of society. And so because of that, they latch on to one of these ideologies like radical Islam, like white supremacy. We could go down the list on and on and on, but that's the reason a lot of these usually young men, even though there's some exceptions to that as well, latch on to these ideologies because they feel like nobody is listening to me and I don't really have a sense of community. And so they find their sense of community in these groups, and they can kind of blame the problems in their life and the reason they don't feel like their life is fulfilled on whatever group that the hate group focuses on, in this case, the Jews, for example. So that's why I'm saying put yourself in the mind, at least to a degree, of somebody that is, his life isn't going right and everything seems to be not working out the way that it should in his own head. He latches onto this ideology that tells him it's not your fault. It's not your fault. You're supposed to have all the things that you want. You're supposed to have, a beautiful wife and a great paying job. You are entitled to all of these things. The reason you don't have them is because there are certain people that are robbing you of what's rightfully yours. They're robbing you of the things that you as a white person are entitled to and ought to have. And it's those Jews, or it's those Muslims, or whatever other group that they want to target. And then you buy into that ideology and you present it to other people around you. And the vast majority of people that aren't on the internet, that are out there in the real world, and there may be some exceptions to this as well, but the vast majority of people write it off. They don't pay attention. And so then you feel like nobody is listening to me. Nobody is paying attention to me. And you become starved for attention. And then all of a sudden, you're watching TV. And you see another person like you, a fellow white supremacist, that commits this horrific act against a particular group. And then you think, wow, look at this guy. Not only is he famous now and everybody's talking about him, but they're talking about his ideas. People are finally listening to him. And then they start thinking, if I did that, people would finally be paying attention to me and listening to me, and maybe then they'll finally actually take me seriously. I'm not saying this is the case for every mass shooter, but it is true, and you can look at the statistical data to back it up, as I have several times and mentioned it on the show, that it seems as though these bursts and these times where mass shootings occur more often, they cluster, which would suggest that the biggest contributing factor to inspiring mass shooters is not a political philosophy or what's going on, it's other mass shooters. And you can do this by even looking into some of the manifestos and the writings of some of the people that are engaged in these activities. That they will specifically cite people like the mass shooters in Columbine, or the mass shooters in this guy's case in Christchurch and the Tree of Life Synagogue. They cite other people that do similar things. And so the reason that I don't mention the names, and the reason I don't think that it's wise to go too deep into the ideology or talk too much about the ideas of these mass shooters, is because if you go too far with that, it gives other mass shooters out there that are watching the idea, well, this is the way to get my ideas out there to where people will finally actually pay attention and listen and take me seriously. And that's the reason it's so incredibly dangerous to do that. And what the exact correct balance is, I'm not sure, but I know the way we're doing it now isn't working because this is continuing to take place. And again, I'm not blaming the media. I'm not saying the only person that is responsible for this horrific act is the shooter. Period. I'm not saying that the media is to blame. I'm not saying the political climate or anything like that is to blame. The shooter is to blame. But I'm saying there are risk factors that are involved here that I think it's wise for us to take a look at and see, okay, what way can we mitigate the risk factors at least as much as possible, to where we may not eradicate the chance of another mass shooting like this, but let's at least lower the possibility of it as much as we can. All right, so it looks like we have a caller on line 1, so we'll go ahead and go to the phones. Good afternoon. What's your name?
Hey, good afternoon.
Hey, what's on your mind?
Listen, I call this with what you've been talking about with regard to the shooters and getting the attention and that kind of thing and becoming relevant. They ought to take the Major League Baseball policy. Anytime an idiot jumps out of the stands and runs across the field or something like that, they don't show them anymore. They don't give their names. They tackle them, take them out of the ballpark, and then ban them. And, it's not going to stop all of this, but it might help.
Well, and that kind of goes along with what I was talking about. There are still crazy fans that rush the field, but the point is it lessens the likelihood of it.
Yeah. Well, what I'm talking about, these are the kind that they want attention. It used to happen a lot more than it does now.
Yep.
I can recall it happen. It's especially the bigger the event, the more likely it was to happen. And it's almost ceased because of the reaction that the organizations, doesn't matter what the sport is, because of the way that they react.
Mm-hmm.
And so, plus a couple of them have been tackled by great big baseball players and gotten waylaid. And that may have had something to do with it too. I don't know. But, and of course, that's not nearly as serious of a subject as this is.
No, it's not. But there is a similar psychological reaction that you're saying there.
And there are a lot of, dealing with so many young people through the years, there are some that just feel so irrelevant and like they want to make a difference in the world, even if it's a bad difference. They feel so withdrawn from the world that they have no value. And you can go back to that. Look at the psychological profile that was done on Lee Harvey Oswald.
Right.
That's a perfect example of someone that was like that. He became relevant, an overnight sensation. Not the right kind, but he became that. And that's a similar kind of mindset. And they're typically edged, radical people. It doesn't matter about the philosophy. They can be incredibly liberal or progressive, or they can be incredibly the other way, or religious fanatics.
Sure.
It doesn't matter. It's whatever it is, and there are people that go over the edge like that. And a lot of times you find a lot of baggage in their background that has contributed to that.
Right, and that's the thing. I think that especially some people in the media and then just sort of in general, they want to make sense of something, which is understandable. I don't think that that's a wrong-headed thing to want to understand why this happened. But some of them attribute a lot of this to society as a whole. And you kind of have to come at it from the standpoint of, even if the person was living in the best possible society, there's still going to be some people that behave badly like this. So we just need to ask the question of what's going to limit that possibility as much as possible. And I think the answer is, and I think that you'll agree with me, that this kind of stuff was incredibly rare, virtually unheard of, when we had a society that was centered around the principles and the moral ideas that were founded in the scripture.
Oh, yeah.
And because of that, because what you said, the motive of a lot of these people, or if nothing else, the starting point of it, regardless of the philosophy, is this feeling of meaninglessness and emptiness. And the Bible corrects that. It gives us purpose. And now there are so many people that may not necessarily take it anywhere near the level that this guy did, but there is a general sense of nihilism and the world doesn't matter and what I do doesn't matter. The Bible's message is the opposite. The Bible says everything that you do matters, and it matters to God. Yeah.
Well, I got to get to Mississippi, so I'll let you go, but I've enjoyed the topic today. It's been good.
All right. Thank you much. Okay. So, yeah, it really is it's quite an ordeal that this happened, but I do think there are some lessons learned here, and I want to talk about, and I'm doing this because I want to talk about it, and I also think it's because it's something that we should talk about. Because we've talked a lot about the person committing this act. Let's talk about the heroes. Let's talk about the people that actually prevented lives from being lost. Because as great as it was, and I would say comfortably, probably an act of divine providence, that this guy's gun jammed, that makes precious little difference if the guy is free to open up his firearm and unjam it. And I don't know how badly it was jammed, but that was at least a possibility. And so because of that, let's sort of look at some of the heroes involved. First of all, one of the heroes is a U.S. Border Patrol agent and a synagogue member, and another synagogue member who is not a Border Patrol agent, and to our knowledge doesn't have any combat training or anything like that, a guy named Oscar Stewart, are the two men that chased him away. And here's sort of a description from an eyewitness account of what happened. While Mr. Stewart was near the vehicle, an off-duty Border Patrol agent caught up to the vehicle and yelled for Mr. Stewart to get out of the way. The Border Patrol agent then fired a weapon in the suspect's direction, striking the vehicle as it drove away. Mr. Stewart risked his life to stop the shooter and saved lives in the process. And that is really great to hear. That there was an off-duty Border Patrol agent, and this is an area of, this is San Diego, so this is an area of California where they have to deal with this a lot, so it makes sense that there would be a lot more Border Patrol agents there. This is apparently a guy of Jewish descent that works for Border Patrol and happens to be a worshiper at this synagogue. Happens to be a Jewish man that just works there, and then this other guy, because we don't have the name of the Border Patrol agent, but we do know Oscar Stewart. So kudos to the two of you, and thank you for your heroism and bravery that probably saved at least a few lives. Because the Border Patrol agent having a firearm on him himself to be able to defend himself and to be able to defend the lives of those around him, and this guy who was willing to rush him unarmed, which is an incredibly brave thing to do. Even if the guy's gun is jammed, it still takes a good amount of courage to just have faith that you're going to get there before his gun is unjammed. And so both of these individuals risking their lives to protect others, bravo to the both of you. And Mr. Stewart, for someone who doesn't seem to have any formal training in this, didn't have a weapon himself, especially your bravery is something to be commended. And of course, it also is a testament to the Border Patrol that we have find people like this, that even when they're not on duty, their job doesn't stop. Even when they're not wearing the uniform, that they still take it upon themselves to do the right thing and protect others. And it is really a testament to Border Patrol and law enforcement that we have nationwide in general. So thank you so much for your courage, which probably saved lives that day. And that brings me to some lessons learned. What are some lessons that we can take away from this? What are some things that we can look at this situation, look at the story, and say, these are what really ought to be the takeaway here? First of all, and we're looking at the heroes who were able to stop this guy with a gun. A good guy with a gun stopped a bad guy with a gun. And you may remember that a very similar thing happened in the Christchurch mosque shooting, where even though it wasn't the gun that he had on him, that there was the guy who took it upon himself to take action through, of all things, a credit card scanner at the guy, then picked up his gun, scared him off, and was able to chase him away from the mosque. And you'll recall that at the two sites where this happened, where these white supremacists teamed up and tried to take out two different mosques, the mosque that had somebody that was able to pick up the gun and take action and take this guy out, that one had less deaths and less casualties. So because of that, it does show that the will to act and to fight back, especially if you happen to be armed yourself, is a great asset in a situation like this. And I've said for a long time, I don't care what group is the one being persecuted. If the Christians are being persecuted, you arm the Christians. If the Jews are being persecuted, you arm the Jews. If the Muslims are being persecuted, arm the Muslims. If the women are being persecuted or sexually abused or raped, arm the women. If you've got hate groups going after gay people, arm the gay people. The solution is the same, doesn't matter. Guns are the great equalizer when it comes to this. And the Second Amendment is for everybody. Everybody. That's the reason that it was put here, is so you can't say to one group of people or another group of people, no, you're not allowed to arm yourself. The right to life and the right to self-preservation is a God-given right to everybody. And so regardless of what group it is, regardless of what demographic we're talking about, whether it's religion, race, sex, doesn't matter. If there is a group that is being persecuted, that group needs to be armed and needs to be ready to defend themselves. Doesn't mean we won't take steps to defend them as well. I'm just saying that in this country where we have a right to bear arms, and in every country where there is a right to self-preservation, we have a responsibility to do the best that we can to be prepared for any eventuality. We are the first responders and the first line of defense, and it is incumbent upon us to make sure that we and the people around us are safe. It's a sacred duty that we have towards our fellow man. And it's the reason I carry, and I carry pretty much everywhere I go, including worship. And it's the reason that millions of other Americans do exactly the same thing. Another lesson to take away. A good guy that was unarmed did the right thing and stopped a bad guy with a gun. That's another lesson to take away from this. And I said this after the mosque shooting, where the guy hurled the credit card reader at the guy and then got his gun away from him. I mean, it would have been nice to have the gun first, and he probably could have saved even more lives if he had been armed from the beginning. But the point is, just like that guy or the Waffle House shooter, you remember that, where the guy just basically slammed the bathroom door in his face and knocked him over and then struggled to get the gun away from him? Did it completely unarmed? Look, a firearm would definitely be useful in a situation like that, but just because you don't have a firearm doesn't mean you shouldn't fight back. Because people that fight back save others' lives. And obviously, it's best if you have a firearm and can neutralize the threat quickly and more effectively. But whether you do or not, in situations like this, just running away doesn't help anybody. Now, if you're somebody that can't fight back, if you're injured or something like that, but if you are a strong, able-bodied man especially, then you should take it upon yourself to fight back, because that's going to increase your chance of surviving, and it's going to increase everybody else's. And sadly, there are heroes that are no longer with us in this situation that have done that. For example, the coach that you may remember in the Parkland shooting that probably saved quite a few lives going after the psychopath that shot up the Parkland High School. Their courage, even if it winds up in the loss of their life, is not something that goes unappreciated. And for people like Coach Aaron Fries, and for this guy who, Oscar Stewart, who was there, that wanted to do the best that he could, armed or not, to chase this person away, remember, it is the will to fight and the desire to act that is the most important in a situation like this. And another thing to remember, another takeaway from this story, is that California's insanely strict gun laws did absolutely nothing to deter this person. And that is also something that we need to remember. That California has some of the most restrictive gun laws in the country, probably the most restrictive in the country. And yet, didn't do anything for this guy. This guy was still able to legally purchase his firearm. Now, they didn't know that he was the one involved in the arson, but if they had, obviously that would have automatically disqualified him in any state in the union from owning a firearm. That's a violent crime. But nonetheless, what we're looking at here is, for all California's talk about not having situations like this and ending this, California has a high proportion, and part of it's because they're a big state and they have a big population. I understand that. I'm not trying to make bad arguments here. I'm just saying that they keep telling us that we need blue state-esque gun control laws to make everybody safe, and then we constantly see mass shootings, and sometimes they happen in blue states with very restrictive gun laws. And California is one example of that. It also happens in red states. We've seen mass shootings in Texas, and we've seen mass shootings in purple Florida, but we also see them in blue states. And that's the point, that these laws are put in place, but they don't do anything to deter the mass shootings. Now, they do something to deter the legal gun owner from exercising his constitutional rights, but they don't really do anything for the lawbreaker. They don't do anything to inhibit that person. And that's another lesson that needs to be remembered, that even with California's insanely strict gun laws, it didn't do anything to stop this horrendous act by this person, because the gun is not the problem. The person is the problem. And that's really the bottom line here. And now you've got people, journalists from lots of different networks, notably the one that I heard that probably has been repeated the most, like Don Lemon, trying to suggest, just like they did in the wake of the New Life synagogue that was shot up earlier in Pittsburgh, happened last year. When they talk about white supremacy, which is a real problem, being on the rise, and they talk about this happening, they want to at least give kind of partial blame or vaguely sort of insinuate that somehow Donald Trump is behind it. That's what they want to do. And Don Lemon is no exception, saying that he thinks that Donald Trump's call to Rabbi Goldstein was insincere. For those of you who didn't hear it, and that was something that occurred earlier on the Ben Shapiro show on News Radio 1440, the rabbi had said it earlier this week. What he was saying is that the call that he received from President Trump in the wake of this attack, and remember, this is the rabbi that was protecting his grandson and protecting his family and lost one of his fingers and got injured in this shooting. He said that the president's call to him was so incredibly comforting. And what really struck me about this is that when he spoke to him, he said, it wasn't just that it was a president of the United States talking to me. You could tell it was somebody that empathized with me and shared my pain. Now look, I can't see into Donald Trump's heart. I can't. But based on the way that the rabbi recanted that story, or not recanted, regaled us with that story, the way that he came out and explained how that took place, and you can hear the man and the emotion in his voice, I just don't believe that that was insincere. Does Donald Trump mess up a lot? Yes. Does he say things that are insensitive and offensive a lot? Yeah, he does. But unless he just completely snowed this guy, and unless he was just incredibly convincing, I don't believe that call was insincere. I don't. And of course, Lemon's reasoning behind that is he claims that it was because, well, Trump's really an anti-Semite. That's what he kind of suggests. And part of his rationale is because of Charlottesville. And admittedly, and I've gone over this 10,000 times, yes, Donald Trump did a stupid thing when talking about Charlottesville and saying that there were fine people on both sides. Yeah, that was a dumb thing. We got it. Move on. Are you really suggesting that the guy who moved the embassy and showed more political courage than any of our previous presidents since my lifetime when it came to Israel, that the guy that moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which was a very clear sign on the world stage that the United States supports Israel and stands firm with them against her enemies, and the man that also has a Jewish son-in-law and a daughter that converted to Judaism with her husband, and this same father, Donald Trump, who became father-in-law to this Jewish man, is not only just someone that tolerates him being in his family, but made him a top White House advisor, which granted may not have been a good idea, but just because of Kushner's ability, not because of his lineage. You're really trying to tell me that that guy secretly hates Jews? Come on. You got to do better than that. And remember that this is the same left that swears up and down that Ilhan Omar is not an anti-Semite. The one that supports the boycotting of Israel and says that Jews have hypnotized the world, and saying that the Jews are a force for evil, and insinuating that Jews that are loyal to Israel have dual loyalty and are really traitors to America. That person's not an anti-Semite. But the guy that moved the embassy to Jerusalem and has a Jewish son-in-law and a Jewish daughter, he's the anti-Semite. I don't know if they just really think Americans are that stupid, or they know that because nobody's going to call them out on their crap, that they just say whatever they want and know that there's no repercussions for them. But either way, I don't see how you could even come close to making that case. Trump has a lot of flaws. He is a very flawed individual. I am quick to point out those flaws on this program on a regular basis. But I see no evidence for him being an anti-Semite, and I see a mountain of evidence to the contrary. If anything, he's the most Jewish-friendly president we have had since Reagan. And I'm not saying that to disparage any of the previous presidents as anti-Semites. I'm just saying that he's the most pro-Israel, pro-Jewish president we have had in my entire generation. Since the millennials have been around, he's the most pro-Jewish president we've had. You can't make the case to me that he's sympathetic to people that kill Jews. And to suggest, as Don Lemon did, that Donald Trump's rhetoric is giving a license to these people is absolutely insane. And it's even more insane when you consider, and you look into this guy's writings, that he himself didn't like Donald Trump. That the shooter in the synagogue said he was not a Donald Trump fan. And guess what? Most white supremacists aren't, for the reasons that I just laid out. I remember Vox did that interview in Charlottesville where they talked to one of the guys that was one of the group leaders for the alt-right and the Nazi march. And he said, I like some of the things that Donald Trump has done, but there's no way that somebody like Donald, we need somebody that's far more anti-Jew than Donald Trump. How could he let his daughter marry a Jewish man? So when they actually do encounter these white nationalists, they don't like Trump either. That's something that the left and the white nationalists have in common. Nonetheless, they're continuing to say that. And frankly, I'm just so sick. And I mean really sick of constantly dissecting tragedies to try to figure out how this proves our point. I mean, you feel as though, and I say this as somebody that is an observer of news and watches it constantly. You feel as though when one of these tragedies comes out, and it happens on both sides, I'm not saying it's just on the left, that the details of the story start trickling in, and the first question on a lot, maybe not all, but a lot of the media's mind is, how does this play towards our narrative? And they look at each other and they plan out their segments. And they're trying to figure out, okay, how do we make this work in our favor? What kind of gun did he use? Did he use a gun at all, or was this a bombing? What religion is he? What political affiliations did he have? And I'm not saying that we don't need to talk about that. I'm not saying that those things are not important to help us understand why this took place. But dadgummit, it feels like that's the only thing that we do now. And I do think there's some lessons to be learned from some of the shootings. I'm not saying that we can't draw anything from them, but I'm tired of the first reaction always being, all right, well, it seems like, okay, this guy was using a gun, but it wasn't a gun that we really want to ban right now. So we won't really focus on that. What we're going to do is we're going to focus on the fact that this guy really hated Muslims, and we're going to use that as a way to kind of wedge against our political opponents and say that, well, this proves that their rhetoric is causing all this death and destruction and they're terrible people, and maybe we can use that to win the next election. For goodness sake, are there not more important things to worry about at that point? Can we not let the families grieve, at least for a little bit, or wait until the bodies get cold before we try to use the death of their loved ones as political fodder? Please. Is that too much to ask? Because I don't think it is. I don't think it's too much to ask that the families have to deal with watching the news coverage of their family members being brutally murdered, whether it was being shot or bombed or whatever it was, to, for Pete's sake, not try to use that tragedy to win the next election or to try to get a policy proposal that you want through. And yes, it happens on both sides. I'm old enough to remember when Donald Trump saw the truck. You remember when the truck ran over people in New York and tried to use that as a way to push his Muslim ban. It happens on both sides. I get that. But it's wrong no matter who does it. And frankly, I'm sick of us seeing these tragedies and pulling out the details and saying, all right, which ones support the narrative that we like? Okay, that helps us, that doesn't. We're going to focus on these two. We're going to run with that. Maybe we'll be able to get this new policy through. Maybe we can get the Senate to vote on that if we present the story this way and turn public opinion this way. Are we not better than this? I got to tell you, for the longest time, I was really convinced that people that didn't pay attention to the news were just lazy and didn't want to deal with it. And that if this country was going to be saved, it was going to be saved by the people that actually do pay a lot of attention to the news and try to. I got to be honest, I'm worried about that now because I think I was wrong. And I'm wondering, because I think that the average person that doesn't spend a lot of time on this and doesn't have a career in it like I do, I think they're watching this and they're watching how everybody just tries to pick apart the story and take the certain details out that they want, that pushes the narrative that they like. That they see how people do that and they turn even something that should be somber, like this horrific shooting that took place against people just for believing what they believed and genetically being who they were. Just happened to have Jewish blood in their veins, and because of that, some psychopath thought that it was okay for him to kill them. And they see people in the media extrapolate the little tidbits of the story that helps their narrative and think it makes their candidates more likely to win and focus on that and fight with each other about it. And they see that and they're like, you know what? I'm done. It's too much. I'm just going to take care of my family and do my job and all of that. And I'm just going to ignore all this junk that is constantly happening because it doesn't help anybody. And I got to be honest, at this point, looking at this and seeing it happen over and over and over again, I don't blame them. If we want people to be more involved in the civil discourse, if we want people to be more involved in politics, whether it's local or federal, maybe what we need to do is be more cautious in how we handle the news. And I'm not saying that you don't ever do anything controversial or you don't try to draw lessons out of stories like this. I'm just saying maybe a shift in priority would be healthy here. And try to remember that not everything should be used as a political club to beat your opponents over the head. And maybe if we remember that, maybe we'll be doing a lot better as a country as a whole. Just a thought. I tell you what, we're going to go ahead and go to a break and I'll be back in a minute.
And now for a reading from the Social Justice Warrior Bible with Pastor Gregory Post.
Welcome in. I'm Gregory Post, head pastor at the Eternal Living Word Trans-Denominational Community Church and Coffee House in Novato, California. And now for a reading from the SJW Bible. Today's reading will be from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 7, verses 2 through 10. And a centurion's slave was sick and about to die. When he had heard about Jesus, he sent some Jewish elders asking him to come save the life of his slave. When they came to Jesus, they earnestly implored him, saying, "He is worthy for you to grant this to him, for he loves our nation, and it was he who built our synagogue." Now Jesus was triggered upon hearing this and said, "None of the good things he has done matter, because he is a slave owner, and we must never admit that anyone that ever owned slaves is capable of doing anything good. Furthermore, instead of asking me for help, you should have passed universal health care by now so that he could receive treatment for free." Then Jesus started on his way with them, and when he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends, saying, "Lord, do not trouble yourself further, for I am not worthy for you to come under my roof. For this reason I did not even consider myself worthy to come to you, but just say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I am also a man placed under authority, with soldiers under me, and I say to this one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my slave, do this, and he does it." Now when Jesus heard this, he marveled at him, and turned and said to the crowd that was following him, I say to you, this man is engaged in systematic oppression. He is clearly engaging in wage slavery by controlling the means of production to exploit the labor of those around him. Then Jesus gathered up a mob and protested on the centurion's lawn all night long with torches and signs reading, "Down with the patriarchy," terrifying him and his family. We never really found out what happened to the centurion's slave. Wow. So inspiring. Thank you for listening to this reading of the SJW Bible, and remember, the only truth that matters is your truth.
Welcome back. Thank you so much for being with us through the break. And I got to tell you, I know I promised I would do my Avengers review, but I'm not sure it's appropriate at this point, considering the tone of the show and the way that it's gone. I loved the movie, I really did, and I want to spend some time on it, but I just don't think I could do a good review right now. I think that comparatively, especially with what we just talked about, it just seems so trivial that I think we're going to save that for tomorrow's show. And I got to be honest, in the wake of that, nothing else really seems all that important either. So we're going to go to the only thing that I think is actually important to be said right now, and that is the chaplain's report.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
Chaplain's report today comes from the book of Daniel. We're going to continue our study in the book of Daniel. And we just sort of wrapped up chapter 4, so we're going to go ahead and start chapter 5. And you may remember, and I think that this context gives a little help, that King Nebuchadnezzar has been doing this back and forth thing with God, which isn't healthy for him and it's not healthy for his kingdom. That he'll go through these periods where he'll act like a pagan king and ignore God and ignore the blessings that God has given to him. And then God either shows him something or punishes him in some way. And he winds up returning to God and returning to a place where he knows that God really is supreme and starts acknowledging that. And then, of course, the cycle starts over and he falls away and starts acting in a pagan way and sort of going back to his old ways of life. And this is really the conclusion of Nebuchadnezzar's part in the story of Daniel. And so we're going to see that play out. And we're going to read just the first part of that in Daniel chapter 5, verses 1 through 4. Belteshazzar, remember that Belteshazzar is Daniel's name. Belteshazzar, the king, held a great feast of 1,000 of his nobles, and he was drinking wine in the presence of the 1,000. When Belteshazzar tasted the wine, he gave orders to bring the gold and the silver vessels which Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, that the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. In verse 3, Then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God, which was in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank the wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Those of us that are familiar with the way that the story goes knows that it doesn't end very well. But before we even get to that point, I want to bring your attention to this. Do you notice what is going on here? That Belteshazzar, or Daniel, as we know him, and that's his Hebrew name, of course, he's bringing forth these vessels because he's serving the king, and that's the way that this is something that he's supposed to do. And he's specifically bringing vessels that Nebuchadnezzar has raided from the Israelites and taken out of the temple of God and they are using them to party and drink wine and all this other stuff. That's what they happen to be using at this time. And you'll notice that when he is together with his dinner party and his friends, what they are talking about is the vessels themselves, and talking about how amazing they are and how beautiful they are. And this conversation goes away to where they suddenly start praising their gods, gods of stone and wood and gold. And it's really not clear whether they're talking about gods that are made of these things, in other words, they're crafted as idols out of these materials, or it's talking about the gods that specifically reign over those materials, because in the pagan world, either one could be true. But the point is, regardless of what is actually being said here, it really doesn't matter, because they're praising idols that don't exist. And what's hilarious about it is that they're doing so with vessels that were crafted specifically to serve the one true God. They're doing so essentially by God's own power and authority. Not to say that the vessels themselves are mythical or anything, or that they have special powers or anything like that. That's not the point. What I'm saying is, these vessels were crafted specifically to worship the one true God of Jerusalem, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And now these are being used in such a way that people are looking at them in Nebuchadnezzar's household and in his dinner party and praising their own pagan gods. And there's a pretty clear message that I think can be used here, because I don't think that this is something that really is all that foreign to us. You see, we live in an increasingly secularized world. And what we don't often remember and look back on is that the reason that we have all the modern conveniences when it comes to science, technology, our advancements in human reasoning, the Enlightenment, all of those things are built on the foundation of Judeo-Christian principles. And I think that the way our society is going in a lot of ways actually mirrors what is going on at Nebuchadnezzar's dinner party. With the very vessels that were crafted so that people may worship God and to assist them in that endeavor, they are using them for revelry and drunkenness and idolatry. And they're worshiping the created rather than the creator. And ironically, they're doing this specifically because they have built, or they have these vessels that were built to serve God in the first place. And that's what's being done now. It actually reminds me of a correspondence between Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Paine. You see, Thomas Paine had kind of abandoned those pillars, those foundations that were talking about the Judeo-Christian tradition and morality itself. And even though Paine really paid homage to God and talked about how he had influenced this enlightenment of man early in his writings, as he started writing a little bit later in his life, you could tell he was kind of moving away from that. And Ben Franklin, who was probably the least religious of all the founders, I mean, he was certainly a believer in God, but it's hard to even make the case that he was a Christian. He had some doubts about the divinity of Jesus, even though he did believe in the Christian God and he believed in the teachings of Jesus. And essentially what Franklin says is, how dare you repudiate the foundations that you are benefiting from right now? Because Thomas Paine was living in liberty because of the work of people that believed in God and specifically crafted that liberty so that men would be able to worship God as they chose. And in the same way that people misuse liberty today, in the same way that people abuse the liberty and the freedom and the conveniences and the wealth and everything else that we have been blessed with by God, specifically because our society was originally founded on the Judeo-Christian tradition, it's ironic that they use that very liberty and that same reason and that same logic and that same enlightenment to try to move away from God and to worship other things and worship the creation itself. You see, the truth is, the modern day atheist is really not much different from the ancient pagan. They both, in many cases, worship nature and worship the things that are created and the things that exist here on this earth, as opposed to the God of heaven. And many times they do so on the backs of those who crafted something specifically to be used for God's glory. You see, in the same way that the gold and the silver and the wood that created these vessels were made by Israelites that did so because they wanted to worship God, you also have to remember that God made the gold and the wood and the stone and everything else to begin with anyway. And really, God was at the center of all of that. And yet you have these people that show no appreciation, no gratitude, and are worshiping the creation, the thing that God made, rather than God himself. They're missing the picture. And they're worshiping really their own wants and desires and gluttony and lust, instead of being thankful for what they've been given, being humble about it, and thanking God for what he has done for them. And if we, as a society or as individuals, forget that God is at the source of all the things that we are able to enjoy now, that it is God that allows us to reason and to think clearly and to be able to go out and make gain and improve the circumstances of our life. If we lose sight of that, then as a society, we're certainly going to fail. And as an individual, we will be eternally lost trying to fill this God-shaped hole that only God can fill. And with Nebuchadnezzar and his dinner guest, who are using these vessels originally intended to worship God, to instead reflect on their own gods and their own self-interest. If we continue down this path, we'll meet the same end that they did. And we'll talk about what that end is in the installment, hopefully tomorrow, when we look a little bit further into the book of Daniel. But the main thing and the main takeaway that we need to remember is that we need to be honest about where all of this came from. And when we look around in the world, we need to not look at it and think about how impressive we are or how clever or skilled we are to be able to give ourselves all of these things. We need to remember that all those things, including our abilities and our will and our lives themselves, ultimately they all come from God, and ultimately God is going to be the one that we have to answer to in the way that we reacted to him and treated him and the others around us. That's something that Nebuchadnezzar lost sight of many times in the scripture. And it did not end well for him. Stay the course, friends.
Tactics is a production of News Radio 1440 and Cumulus Media Montgomery. Any opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Cumulus Media. The theme song for Tactics is 6 Foot Town by Big and Rich. Graphics by Jessica Dawson. Broadcast studios provided by Cumulus Media Montgomery. Location studios provided by the Dalraida Church of Christ. Copyright 2019.